I'd like to take just a minute to talk about how we got in this mess from my perspective. Again, this is what I believe. I believe, looking back, since 9/11, we have had a collection of policies that created a stew, that created bubbles in housing and energy, commodities, and that stew was a loose fiscal policy managed by the Fed, loose monetary policy managed by the Fed, loose fiscal policy managed by Congress and the administration, previous administration primarily, in my view, responsible, because we had lots of money growth, very low interest rates over a protracted period. At the very time we had a loose fiscal policy, massive increase in deficits and debt under the Bush administration, and with an overlay of deregulation. I hear some of my colleagues say, let's have more tax cuts and more deregulation. Really? That worked great. That's exactly what was done during the Bush administration. And at the end of the Bush administration, we were on the brink of financial collapse. If that was such a brilliant strategy, how is it that we were then on the brink of financial collapse? Because that's where we were. Now, I personally believe it's an overly loose monetary policy, overly loose fiscal policy, and deregulation, or really not deregulation. There was no regulation of derivatives that brought us to the brink of collapse. That does not mean we shouldn't reduce regulations in other places, because clearly we do have a regulatory burden. In many places it makes no sense. I don't argue against that. But the notion that all regulation is bad is part of the reason we're in this mess. Hello? What was happening with AIG? A little small unit takes unbelievable risks with derivatives and puts us on the brink of financial failure. I'll never forget being called to a meeting in the Capitol, leadership of the House and the Senate, Republican and Democrat, and the Secretary of the Treasury in the Bush administration, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, saying to us they're taking over AIG the next morning because if they didn't, there'd be a financial collapse in 10 days. I wasn't the Secretary of the Treasury in this administration. That was the Secretary of the Treasury in the Bush administration, saying if they didn't take over AIG, where there was no regulation of derivatives, that we would have a financial collapse. So that's my own view of how we got in it. And how we get out is, I believe, a combination of things. I do believe when the economy is extraordinarily weak, the only one strong enough to come in and provide additional aggregate demand is the Federal Government. That is a Keynesian idea. I subscribe to it. I believe it is correct that you have got to have the government come in to provide a lift to aggregate demand. Otherwise, the spiral will only get worse. I believe the policies adopted by, interestingly enough, at the end of the Bush administration, by the Bush administration, and then followed by the Obama administration, prevented a depression. I believe that. I believe history will record that. Dr. Zandi, your report suggests that. I also believe that we are on an utterly unsustainable course with debt, and it is imperative that we put together a credible, serious, long-term debt reduction plan. So I've found myself at odds with the right and the left. I think both of them are not reacting to the reality of the moment that we face now, that requires changes in an awful lot of what we're doing. And I believe that means fundamental tax reform to, yes, in part raise additional revenue, but I also believe we've got to cut spending, and I also believe we've got to reform the entitlements. And, you know, some of my friends on the left don't want to reform entitlements. I don't think they're right. I think what the trustees have told us is true. Those programs are headed for insolvency if we fail to act. And I believe our friends on the right that say you don't have another dime of revenue are dead wrong. I believe they're both right. We not only have the highest spending in 60 years as a share of GDP, we have the lowest revenue in 60 years as a share of GDP. Both are true. And it's no wonder we've got record deficits and record debt. And I also happen to agree, one place Senator Sessions and I do agree, I believe the report of Rogoff and Reinhart, when you get a debt of more than 90% of GDP, gross debt, you have endangered and weakened your future economic prospects. And I don't know, Senator Sessions, if it's 1% that is in the Rogoff-Reinhart analysis, or it's the half of 1% Dr. Hassett is talking about. I think in a way we're talking about two different things, because they're talking about the average from the 200 years of economic history, the 44 countries they examined. You're talking, I think, about our specific circumstances. But in either case, we're talking about a reduction in future economic growth, and it would be wildly irresponsible for us not to respond. I think the differences here lie more in timing than they do in a question of what has